"I think someone dumped him here to die." Dr. Sarah Whitman's voice trembled as she crouched beside the shivering golden retriever, his matted fur glistening under the dim light of the street lamp. The alley was quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind rattling an old chain-link fence, the world seemingly unaware of the little life clinging to hope in the shadows. The dog's whimpers were barely audible, but they sliced through the silence like a desperate plea. She reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing against the damp fur. He flinched, drawing back against the cold brick wall. His ribs jutted out sharply beneath his thin coat, and a deep cut ran along his left front paw, raw and swollen. Dried blood crusted around it, evidence of days, perhaps longer, of pain and neglect. His deep brown eyes locked onto hers, wide and fearful, yet searching. "It's okay, buddy. I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, pulling a small treat from her coat pocket. It was one she kept for her own dog, Daisy, a golden retriever mix who was likely curled up on the couch at home, waiting for her late return. She tossed it gently toward the stray, letting it land just inches from his nose. He hesitated, nostrils flaring as he caught the scent. Slowly, he edged forward, his weakened frame trembling as he snatched the treat and chewed cautiously. Sarah exhaled in relief. He wasn't completely shut off to kindness. She pulled out her phone and called the only person she knew would be awake at this hour. The line barely rang once before a familiar voice answered. "Tell me you're not in another alley picking up stray animals," said Mark Harris, her best friend and the town's only other full-time veterinarian. His voice carried a mix of exasperation and fondness. "Well, if I told you that, I'd be lying," Sarah replied, keeping her voice soft so as not to startle the dog. "I need your help. He's in bad shape." A sigh came through the line. "Where are you?" "Corner of Maple and 5th, behind the old bakery." "I'll be there in 10. Sarah ended the call and focused on the dog. He was still staring at her, licking crumbs from his muzzle. His tail was tucked so tightly against his belly that it was barely visible. The fear in his eyes wasn't just from being abandoned. It was deeper than that. Something had happened to him. Something that made him distrust humans entirely. She inched a little closer, speaking softly. "You're going to be okay. We're going to figure this out." When Mark arrived, he had a blanket in one hand and a first aid kit in the other. He took one look at the dog and crouched beside her. "Poor guy. Looks like he's been out here for a while." Sarah nodded. "We need to get him back to the clinic. I don't think he can walk on that paw." Mark handed her the blanket. "You want to do the honors, or should I?" She hesitated. "I'll try. He's scared, but he's not aggressive." Carefully, she draped the blanket over him, letting the warmth and softness offer some reassurance. He tensed, but didn't try to bolt. With slow, practiced movements, she wrapped her arms around him and lifted. He was lighter than he should have been, his body weak and trembling against her chest. But he didn't fight her. He only let out a soft, defeated whimper. Mark opened the back door of his SUV, where a large dog crate was already set up. Together, they placed him inside, making sure he was as comfortable as possible. Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, turning back to check on their passenger. "I wonder what his story is," Mark murmured as he started the car. Sarah stared at the dog, who had curled up into a tight ball, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. "I don't know," she said softly, "but we're going to find out." By the time they reached the clinic, the dog had drifted into a light sleep. The moment Sarah unlatched the crate, however, he lifted his head, eyes darting around in panic. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, coaxing him with gentle words as she carried him inside. The warm, sterile air of the clinic was a stark contrast to the cold alley. They settled him onto the examination table, where Sarah began her assessment. His paw was the most immediate concern. She cleaned the wound carefully, noting the deep laceration and the way the swelling suggested an infection. There were other injuries, too. Older scars crisscrossed beneath his fur, some barely visible, others deeper. He had likely been in fights before, but not with other dogs. The marks didn't match the pattern of a typical dog fight. These were precise, deliberate. Mark caught her gaze. "You see what I see?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Yeah." Someone hurt him. Mark exhaled sharply. This wasn't just neglect. This was abuse. She nodded, feeling anger rise in her chest. She had seen too many cases like this, but that didn't make it any easier. "We need to run some tests, blood work, x-rays, everything." As they worked, the dog remained still, his body too drained to resist. But every now and then, his eyes flickered open, watching them with a mix of fear and curiosity, as if some small part of him wanted to believe they weren't like the people who had hurt him before. It was nearly 2 a.m. when they finally had the X-ray results. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she examined them. Mark stood beside her, scanning the images. He let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains a lot." Sarah swallowed hard. "You ever seen anything like this before?" Mark shook his head. "Not in a dog. This is something else." Sarah turned back to the dog, who had drifted into a restless sleep. "Who did this to you?" she murmured. "And why?" The golden retriever didn't answer. But Sarah knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened to him, it was only the beginning of the mystery. And she wasn't going to stop until she found out the truth. Dr. Sarah Whitman didn't sleep that night. She remained in the clinic, moving between her office and the recovery room, checking on the golden retriever every half hour. He lay curled up on the thickest, softest blanket she could find, his breathing slow but steady. Every so often, he'd let out a soft whimper in his sleep, legs twitching as if he were running in a dream, or trying to escape something. Mark Harris had left a couple of hours ago after doing everything he could to stabilize the dog's condition. His parting words had stuck with her. "If someone did this to him on purpose, they're dangerous. Be careful." Sarah had no intention of letting this case slip through the cracks. She'd seen her fair share of abandoned and mistreated animals, but something about this dog, the calculated nature of his injuries, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, told her there was more to his story, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth. By sunrise, the dog was awake again. He lifted his head weakly as Sarah entered the room. His deep brown eyes locked onto her with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. He didn't move away when she knelt beside him, but his muscles tensed when she reached out a hand. "You're safe now," she whispered, keeping her voice soft. She held still, giving him a moment to decide if he would accept her presence. His nose twitched, and then, slowly, he lowered his head back onto the blanket. It wasn't trust, not yet. But it was a start. She grabbed a bowl of warm chicken broth and set it in front of him. He sniffed at it before lapping at the liquid hesitantly. Relief coursed through her as she watched him drink. He wasn't giving up. Mark returned mid-morning with coffee in one hand and a manila folder in the other. "You look like hell," he said, handing her the coffee. "Thanks," she muttered, taking a sip. The caffeine barely made a dent in her exhaustion. "What's in the folder?" "X-ray results. You were right. His injuries weren't just random. He has signs of old fractures that healed incorrectly, some scar tissue around his ribs that suggests repeated blunt force trauma, and Mark hesitated before flipping to a specific scan. This. Sarah's stomach clenched as she looked at the image. A small, dark fragment was lodged near the dog's shoulder blade. Is that a bullet, or more accurately, a bullet fragment? She stared at the X-ray, anger bubbling beneath her fatigue. Someone shot him. Mark nodded grimly. Not recently, though. I'd say it's been there for months, maybe longer. Sarah let out a slow breath, her mind racing. This wasn't just a case of abandonment or casual neglect. This dog had survived something terrible, something deliberate, and someone out there knew exactly what had happened to him. She ran a hand through her hair, frustration mounting. We need to figure out where he came from. Mark leaned against the exam table. I did some digging. There haven't been any recent reports of a missing golden retriever matching his description, but that doesn't mean much. If he was dumped on purpose, no one's going to report him. Sarah considered their options. We could check with local shelters, see if anyone recognizes him. Maybe he belonged to someone who didn't want him anymore. Mark hesitated. There's another possibility. She glanced at him. What? What if he was part of something illegal? Dogfighting rings, backyard breeders, something like that. The thought made her stomach turn. You think he was used as bait? Maybe. The scars, the bullet wound, the fact that he was left to die instead of simply surrendered. It fits. Sarah gritted her teeth. If that were true, then this wasn't just about rescuing one dog. It was about finding out who was responsible and stopping them before more animals suffered. She looked back at the golden retriever, now watching their conversation with quiet wariness. Then we start digging. They spent the next several hours making calls to shelters, rescues, and veterinary clinics within a 50-mile radius. No one recognized the dog or had any reports of a missing golden retriever that fit his description. It was as if he had simply appeared out of nowhere. Frustrated, but not deterred, Sarah turned to the next best option: social media. She snapped a few photos of the retriever, careful to capture both his gentle face and the scars that told his story, and posted them to the clinic's page with a message. Found in an alleyway, injured and afraid. Does anyone recognize this golden retriever? Any leads on his past or where he might have come from would be greatly appreciated. Within an hour, the post had dozens of shares. By evening, it had been shared hundreds of times, spreading far beyond their small town. Messages began trickling in, some offering well wishes, others sharing stories of lost pets, but none providing the answer they needed. Then, late that night, Sarah received a message that made her heart race. I think I know that dog. She clicked on the sender's profile. A woman named Lisa Andrews. The message continued. He looks just like a dog my neighbor had. They moved out months ago, but they weren't good people. I always had a bad feeling about the way they treated their animals. Sarah's hands shook as she typed a response. Do you have their names? Any information about where they might be now? A few minutes passed before Lisa replied. Their last name was Carter. I don't know where they went, but I remember they had a lot of dogs. And one day, they were all just gone. Sarah's breath caught. This was more than just one abandoned dog. She turned to Mark, who had been reading over her shoulder. His expression was grim. If they were involved in something illegal, they didn't just leave town. They disappeared. Sarah swallowed hard. Which means someone else might still be out there, doing the same thing. Mark nodded. And we just put them on notice. The golden retriever let out a soft whine, shifting on his blanket. Sarah met his gaze, determination settling in her chest. "We're going to figure this out," she murmured. "And we're going to make sure no one else goes through what you did." But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning, and whoever had hurt this dog wasn't going to want them digging any deeper. The next morning, Sarah woke up at her desk, her neck stiff from the awkward position she had slept in. The dim light filtering through the clinic window told her it was early, but she could already hear the sounds of life picking up outside. Cars rolling down the street, a few birds chirping. Signs that the world was moving forward, even when she felt stuck in place. She sat up, rubbing the stiffness from her neck before turning her attention to the golden retriever. He was awake, his deep brown eyes locked onto her. His tail didn't wag, but there was a certain awareness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. He was watching her, assessing, trying to understand whether or not she could be trusted. "Morning, buddy," she said softly, pushing herself up from her chair. She grabbed a bowl of food and placed it in front of him. He hesitated, but eventually leaned forward and started eating, slow and methodical. She let out a small breath of relief. He still had an appetite. That was a good sign. Mark arrived not long after, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a small paper bag. "You look like you could use this," he said, handing her one of the cups. Sarah took it gratefully. "You're a lifesaver." Mark sat down across from her and pulled a bagel from the paper bag, tearing off a piece. "I made a few more calls this morning. No one has any missing reports on a golden retriever matching his description. I also tried tracking down anything about the Carter family, but they disappeared off the grid." Sarah sighed. "Figures. But that doesn't mean we stop looking." "No, it doesn't." Mark took a sip of his coffee before nodding toward the dog. "He looks a little more alert today." Sarah smiled faintly. "Yeah, he's eating at least." They sat in silence for a moment, watching as the golden retriever finished his meal. He licked his lips, then turned his head slightly as if listening for something neither of them could hear. Mark was the first to break the silence. "We need a name for him." Sarah thought for a moment before tilting her head. "How about Charlie?" Mark considered it, then nodded. "Charlie, I like it." Sarah turned back to the dog. "Charlie, huh? What do you think?" Charlie didn't react much, but there was something in his eyes that made her think he was listening. For the rest of the morning, they took turns checking on Charlie and going through records, trying to find anything that could give them a lead. The more they searched, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just a case of an abandoned dog. This was something bigger. By midday, Sarah's phone buzzed. She picked it up, glancing at the number. It wasn't one she recognized, but she answered anyway. "Dr. Whitman speaking." A woman's voice, quiet but urgent, came through the line. "You're the one who found the golden retriever?" Sarah sat up straighter. "Yes. Do you know something about him?" The woman hesitated. I think he belonged to my brother." Sarah's heart pounded. "Can you tell me his name? Or anything about him?" A shaky breath came through the phone. "My brother's name was Daniel Carter, and if that's our dog, his name is Rusty." Sarah exchanged a look with Mark. Carter, the same last name as the people Lisa had mentioned. She pressed the phone closer. "You said your brother's name was Daniel. Past tense?" There was silence on the other end. Then, finally, "Daniel's dead." Sarah tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm sorry." The woman sniffled. "He wasn't a bad person. I don't know everything, but I know he got involved with people he shouldn't have. When he died, Rusty disappeared. I thought they had taken him. But if you found him, Her voice cracked. "I just need to know he's okay." Sarah looked at Charlie, Rusty, and felt something shift inside her. "He's safe. He was hurt, but we're taking care of him." "Thank you," the woman whispered. "But if he's still alive, it means they didn't get rid of him. And that means they might come looking for him." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Who?" The woman's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The people my brother was mixed up with. They don't like loose ends." The line went dead. Sarah lowered the phone slowly. Mark was watching her, his expression grim. "What was that about?" "She thinks Charlie, Rusty, belong to her brother, and her brother is dead." Mark exhaled. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Sarah agreed. "And she thinks whoever was after her brother might come looking for Rusty." Mark's eyes darkened. "Then we need to make sure they don't find him." Sarah turned back to Rusty, who was watching them with quiet patience, unaware of the storm brewing around him. She reached out and gently scratched behind his ears. "We're going to keep you safe, buddy," she murmured. "No matter what." Mark nodded. "I'll start making calls. If this is bigger than just a case of animal neglect, we need to be prepared." Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This was no longer just about a dog. This was about finding out the truth. About Daniel Carter, about Rusty, and about whoever might still be out there. And if they were willing to kill once, there was no telling what they'd do next. The atmosphere in the clinic felt heavier than usual, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on Sarah and Mark as they tried to process the call. Rusty lay on his blanket, his eyes shifting between them, sensing the unease in the room. Sarah couldn't shake the woman's warning. If Rusty was a loose end, it meant someone had a reason to come after him, and that meant danger wasn't just a possibility. It was a guarantee. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "We need to do more than just keep him hidden. If someone is really looking for him, they won't stop until they find him." Sarah nodded. "I know, but we don't have much to go on. Just a name, Daniel Carter, and the fact that his sister was scared enough to warn us." Mark sat down, tapping his fingers on the desk. "Maybe we start by figuring out who Daniel Carter was involved with. If he was mixed up with dangerous people, there has to be a record somewhere. We just need to dig deep enough." Sarah exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I'll reach out to Lisa Andrews again. She seemed to know something about the Carter family. Maybe she can tell us more." Mark grabbed his phone. "And I'll see what I can find through some contacts at the station. I don't want to officially bring in the police just yet, but I know a few people who might be willing to pull up some records for us." Sarah glanced at Rusty. He can't stay at the clinic forever. If someone really is after him, this is the first place they'd look. We need to figure out a safe place for him. Mark nodded. "We can take shifts at our houses for now, but that's a temporary solution. We need something more permanent." Sarah sighed. "One thing at a time. Let's start with finding out more about Daniel Carter." She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Lisa, asking if she had time to meet. It didn't take long for a response. "Lisa, I can meet in an hour, coffee shop on Maple." Sarah showed the message to Mark, who nodded. "Good. That gives me time to make some calls. Keep your guard up. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." An hour later, Sarah slid into a booth at the coffee shop. Lisa was already there, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup, her expression tense. "Thanks for meeting me," Sarah said. Lisa nodded, glancing around as if expecting someone to be listening in. "I don't have much time. What do you want to know?" Sarah leaned forward. "Everything you can tell me about Daniel Carter." Lisa swallowed hard. "He wasn't always a bad guy. When we were kids, he was just my big brother. But when he got older, he started running with the wrong people. They made him do things Things I don't think he ever wanted to do, but once you're in, you don't get out." Sarah frowned. "Do you know who these people were?" Lisa hesitated. "I don't know names, but I know they weren't just some small-time criminals. They had power, connections. I think Daniel wanted to leave, but he was scared." Sarah's grip on her coffee cup tightened. "And Rusty?" Lisa's expression softened. "Daniel loved that dog. When things got bad, Rusty was the only good thing he had left. But I think someone used that against him." Sarah's stomach turned. "Used how?" Lisa's eyes darted to the side. "I overheard a conversation once. Someone told Daniel that if he didn't do what they wanted, Rusty would pay the price. And then, a few weeks later, Daniel was dead." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Do you think they killed him?" Lisa bit her lip. "I don't know. But I know Daniel was terrified before it happened, and when he died, Rusty disappeared. I thought they had taken him, maybe hurt him. But if he ended up with you, maybe he escaped." Sarah took a shaky breath. "Then someone might still be looking for him." Lisa nodded. "And if they think he knows something, they won't stop until they find him." Sarah's mind raced. "Do you have any idea where these people might be now? Any places Daniel went to frequently?" Lisa shook her head. "No. After he died, I cut all ties with anything connected to him. I was too scared." Sarah couldn't blame her. "Thank you for telling me. If you think of anything else, please let me know." Lisa nodded, standing up quickly as if she couldn't get out of the coffee shop fast enough. "Be careful. Whoever they are, they're dangerous." Sarah sat there for a long moment, staring at the door Lisa had just walked through. Then she grabbed her phone and dialed Mark. "What did you find out?" he asked as soon as he picked up. "Rusty wasn't just any dog to Daniel. He was leverage." Mark cursed under his breath. "That complicates things. I just got off the phone with a buddy of mine. There's no official record of Daniel's death being suspicious, but I did find something interesting." "What?" "A few weeks before he died, he withdrew every last cent from his bank account." Sarah frowned. "Why would he do that?" "That's the question, isn't it? Either he was running, or he was paying someone off. Either way, it means he was scared." Sarah exhaled slowly. "Which means Rusty could be the last living link to whatever Daniel was involved in." "Exactly. And if someone's still out there trying to cover their tracks, we just put ourselves right in their sights." Sarah looked out the window, her mind spinning. She needed to think, to figure out their next move. But one thing was clear. Whoever had hurt Daniel Carter wasn't done yet. And now, they knew someone was asking questions. Sarah drove back to the clinic, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Mark's words echoed in her mind. Rusty was the last living link to whatever Daniel had been involved in. And that meant whoever had silenced Daniel might still be watching, waiting for their next move. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She pulled into the clinic's parking lot and cut the engine, taking a moment to breathe before stepping out. Inside, Rusty lay curled up on the blanket, his ears perking up slightly when he saw her. He still didn't wag his tail, but at least he didn't flinch away. That was progress. Mark was already inside, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. He looked up as Sarah walked in, his expression serious. "Did Lisa give you anything else?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing concrete, just that Daniel was scared, and Rusty might have been used to control him." Mark set his coffee down. "I don't like this, Sarah. If Daniel was trying to escape something and they found him before he could, that means they're still out there. And if they're looking for Rusty, we need to be ahead of them," she finished. "Which means we need to figure out what Daniel was involved in. Fast." Mark nodded. "I called in a favor from an old friend at the department. He's looking into any criminal activity tied to Daniel Carter's name. But if this was something big, it's likely been buried. Sarah ran a hand through her hair. We need to move Rusty somewhere safe. The clinic is too obvious. Agreed, Mark said. I can take him to my place for a few nights. I've got a fenced backyard, and I can keep an eye on him. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but we need to stay in touch. If anything feels off, you call me. Mark smirked. Always. Together, they carefully led Rusty to Mark's car. He was hesitant at first, his body tensing as they coaxed him forward. But eventually, he climbed in, curling up on the seat as if exhausted. Sarah watched as Mark shut the door, her gut twisting. Something about this felt too calm, too easy. As Mark drove off, Sarah turned back to the clinic. She had work to do. She spent the next few hours digging into anything she could find on Daniel Carter. His social media had been inactive for almost a year before his death. No recent job listings, no clear employment history, nothing that gave her an idea of what he had been involved in. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? A pause. Then a voice, low and rough. Stop looking. Sarah's blood ran cold. Who is this? You don't want to know, but I know who you are. I know what you're doing. And if you keep pushing, you won't like what happens next. Her fingers tightened around the phone. If you're trying to scare me, it's not working. A chuckle. It should. Walk away, Dr. Whitman, before you regret it. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her heart hammering. Someone was watching. Someone knew she was getting close. She immediately dialed Mark. He picked up on the first ring. Everything okay? I just got a call. Someone telling me to back off. Silence on the other end. Then, you think it's connected? No doubt. And if they know about me, they know about Rusty. We need to be careful. Mark exhaled. I'll reinforce the locks at my place, and I'll keep my gun close. Sarah didn't argue. I'm going to keep digging. If someone wants me to stop, it means I'm getting close to something. Just don't get too close, Mark warned. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I won't. But she knew she would. She had no choice now. She turned back to her laptop, scrolling through search results on Daniel Carter. If he had ties to a criminal organization, someone would have noticed. Maybe not under his real name, but aliases, financial records. There had to be something. After an hour of fruitless searching, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. A picture. She clicked on it, and her blood ran cold. It was a photo of her clinic, taken from across the street. Below the image, one word was written. Leave. Sarah's hands shook as she locked the phone. This was real, and it was escalating. Before she could react, the clinic's front door creaked open slightly. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Was it the wind? Or had someone just walked in? She grabbed the nearest object, a metal paperweight, and stepped toward the door, heart pounding. Who's there? No answer. She took another step forward. The waiting room was empty, the lights casting soft shadows against the walls. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She was being paranoid, right? Then, just as she was about to turn back, something caught her eye. A small folded piece of paper on the counter. She walked over, hesitating before picking it up. 3 words were scrawled across the paper in hurried, jagged handwriting. "You were warned." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Whoever was behind this wasn't bluffing. And now they had made their message clear. But they had made one mistake. They had underestimated her resolve. Sarah stood frozen in place, gripping the note between her fingers. The air in the clinic felt heavier now, thick with the weight of the warning she had just received. Her heart pounded, but not with fear, with determination. Whoever was behind this thought they could scare her into backing down. They were wrong. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the note before carefully placing it in a plastic evidence bag she kept in her office. She wasn't going to let this slide. Someone had crossed a line, and she intended to find out who it was. But first, she needed to check on Mark and Rusty. Dialing Mark's number, she pressed the phone to her ear, pacing the clinic as she waited for him to pick up. The call went to voicemail. She frowned. Mark was always quick to answer, especially now, when they both knew they were dealing with something dangerous. She tried again. Still nothing. Anxiety gnawed at her stomach. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, pausing only to double-check that the clinic was locked up securely before getting into her car. The drive to Mark's house felt agonizingly long. Every red light an unbearable delay. She kept glancing at her phone, waiting for a callback, but it never came. By the time she pulled up in front of Mark's house, the sun had set, casting long shadows across his quiet street. His car was parked in the driveway, but the house itself was dark. No lights on inside. No movement. Sarah stepped out of her car, leaving the engine running just in case. She approached the front door, knocking firmly. "Mark, it's me. Open up." Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Dread crept up her spine as she tried the doorknob. It was locked. That was a good sign. It meant Mark had taken precautions. But why wasn't he answering? She walked around to the side of the house, peering through a window. The living room was empty, but Rusty's dog bed was there, along with an overturned water bowl. Something felt off. Deciding she couldn't wait any longer, she pulled out the spare key Mark had given her months ago and unlocked the front door, stepping inside cautiously. The house was eerily quiet. She flipped on a light, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Mark?" Nothing. She moved through the house slowly, checking each room. The kitchen was empty. The back door was locked. She reached the hallway leading to the bedrooms and noticed something on the floor. A phone. Mark's phone. Her breath hitched. She bent down and picked it up. The screen cracked, but still on. A missed call from her. The last outgoing call had been made just 20 minutes ago, to an unknown number. Her stomach twisted. Had Mark been trying to warn someone? Or had someone gotten to him first? A noise from the backyard sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. A rustling sound, like movement in the bushes. Sarah tightened her grip on the phone and moved toward the back door, her fingers hovering over the lock. If someone was out there, she needed to know who. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping onto the back porch. The yard was dark, the only illumination coming from a street light filtering through the fence slats. The wind stirred the trees, making it impossible to tell if someone was really there or if her nerves were playing tricks on her. Then she saw it. Rusty, standing near the fence, his body tense, his gaze locked onto something in the shadows. Sarah's heart pounded. "Rusty, come here, boy." The dog didn't move. Instead, he let out a low, guttural growl, his fur bristling. Whatever he saw, it wasn't friendly. Sarah stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the yard. "Who's there? Show yourself." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a flash of movement, a figure darting toward the fence. Sarah reacted instinctively, rushing forward as Rusty lunged, barking furiously. Whoever it was made it over the fence before she could get a clear look at them, disappearing into the night. Breathing heavily, she knelt beside Rusty, running a hand through his fur. "Good boy. You saw them, didn't you?" Rusty's tail was stiff, his eyes still fixed on the fence. Whoever had been there had left in a hurry, but not before making their presence known. Sarah turned back toward the house, her mind racing. Mark was missing. Someone had been lurking in his backyard, and she had just received a threat at the clinic. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was watching them, and they weren't done yet. She needed to find Mark, and fast. Sarah's heart pounded as she rushed back inside Mark's house, locking the back door behind her. Rusty stayed by her side, his body tense, ears pricked forward, still listening for any sign of the intruder. Mark was missing, and now someone had been lurking in his backyard. This was no coincidence. She needed to think fast. Pulling out her phone, she dialed Mark's number again, even though she knew it was pointless. His phone was still in her hand. Her next call was to the police. It rang twice before a voice answered, calm but firm. 911, what's your emergency? My name is Dr. Sarah Whitman. My friend is missing. I just arrived at his house, and the place looks undisturbed inside, but I found his phone on the floor, and someone was outside in his backyard. I think... She hesitated, taking a deep breath. I think he's in trouble. What's the address? She rattled it off quickly, barely able to keep the shake out of her voice. The dispatcher assured her that officers were on the way and asked her to stay put until they arrived. Sarah paced the living room, her mind racing. Who had taken Mark? And why? More importantly, was he still alive? Rusty lay on the floor beside her, head resting on his paws but still alert, his eyes flicking toward the door every few moments. The knock at the front door came just as blue and red lights flashed outside. Sarah ran to open it, relief flooding through her at the sight of two uniformed officers. "Dr. Whitman?" the older of the two, Officer Grayson, asked. "Yes, thank you for coming." She quickly stepped aside, letting them into the house. "Mark Harris, he owns this house. He's missing. I found his phone on the floor and then someone was outside. Rusty saw them, chased them to the fence, but they got away." Grayson exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger officer who looked barely out of the academy. "Has Mark been acting unusual lately? Any threats?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. We've both been looking into something. Something dangerous. I received a threatening call earlier today telling me to back off. And then I got a picture of my clinic taken from outside. Someone is watching us." Grayson's jaw tightened. "Did Mark mention anything to you about feeling like he was being followed?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but we both knew we were getting close to something." The officers took their time combing through the house, checking the back door and fence. The young officer knelt by Rusty, scratching behind his ears. "He was trying to protect someone," he muttered. "Dogs don't act like this unless they know there's a real threat." Sarah sat on the couch, exhausted but unwilling to stop. "What do we do next? We can't just sit here." Grayson nodded. "We'll put out a missing persons alert for Mark and see if we can track down any leads on his last known whereabouts. You said he was helping you investigate something? What exactly?" Sarah swallowed. "A man named Daniel Carter. He was killed, but before he died, he had this dog, Rusty. We believe Rusty was used to control him, maybe even as leverage. And now, whoever was after Daniel is after Rusty, too. The younger officer frowned. That's a long shot. But if someone thought Mark knew too much, it's possible they came for him. Sarah's stomach twisted. So what do we do now? Wait? Hope he turns up? That's not good enough. Grayson exhaled. We'll do everything we can to find him, Dr. Whitman. In the meantime, you need to be careful. You're not safe either. Sarah clenched her fists. I don't care about being safe. I care about finding Mark. Then let us do our jobs, Grayson said firmly. We'll keep a patrol near your clinic, and I suggest you don't go anywhere alone. If someone is after you, they'll try again. Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Fine, but I'm not sitting on my hands while you investigate. I have resources, too. Grayson sighed, but didn't argue. Just be careful. If you get any more messages or see anything suspicious, call us immediately. The officers took Mark's phone with them, promising to analyze his recent calls and texts. After they left, Sarah sat on the couch, staring at the spot where his phone had been. Rusty lay beside her, resting his head on her knee. She ran a hand over his fur. What now, boy? How do we find him? Rusty didn't respond, of course, but Sarah felt a flicker of determination rise inside her. She couldn't wait for the police to act. Mark was out there somewhere, and she was going to bring him home. First, she needed to go through everything they had gathered about Daniel Carter again. Maybe they had missed something. She pulled out her laptop and opened their files, scanning the notes they had compiled. Daniel Carter had withdrawn every cent from his bank account weeks before his death. That meant he had been preparing to run. But why? And where had that money gone? Her phone buzzed, and she nearly jumped. A text. No caller ID. Just 2 words. Not done. Sarah's breath hitched. Whoever was behind this wasn't backing down. She glanced at Rusty. Guess we just made the top of someone's list. Rusty huffed softly, his tail twitching. Sarah closed her laptop. The pieces were starting to come together, but she was running out of time. If she wanted to save Mark, she had to act now. And that meant putting herself directly in the line of fire. Sarah barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside had her snapping awake, heart pounding. Rusty remained close by, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. He was still on edge, his ears twitching at every small sound. By the time morning came, she was exhausted but more determined than ever. She couldn't wait around for answers. She needed to take action. The text from the unknown sender was still fresh in her mind. Not done. That meant whoever was behind Mark's disappearance was still watching, still moving, and still planning their next step. She opened her laptop and pulled up every bit of information she and Mark had gathered. Daniel Carter had withdrawn his savings before his death. That suggested one of 2 things. Either he was planning to disappear, or he was trying to pay someone off. The missing money could be the key. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed Lisa Andrews, the woman who had first reached out about Daniel. It rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered. Hello? Lisa, it's Sarah Whitman. I need to ask you something about Daniel. A pause. Then, okay? What's going on? Did Daniel ever talk about money problems? Did he owe anyone? Was he paying someone off? Lisa sighed. He never said it directly, but I know he was stressed about something. He told me once that he needed to take care of things before it was too late. I assumed it was just him trying to get his life together. Sarah frowned. Did he ever mention where he kept his money? A bank? A safe? Anywhere he might have stashed it? Lisa hesitated. He never told me, but he was paranoid about banks. He always said cash was safer. If he had money hidden, it wouldn't have been in an account. That confirmed her suspicions. Lisa, if you think of anything at all, call me. I will. Be careful, Sarah. I mean it. Hanging up, Sarah turned to Rusty. If Daniel hid money, where would he have put it? Somewhere safe. Somewhere only he knew. Rusty just blinked at her. Sarah sighed and grabbed her car keys. She couldn't sit still anymore. There was one last place she hadn't checked, Daniel's old apartment. If there was even the slightest chance that the money was still there, she had to find it before someone else did. She drove with purpose, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few minutes. There was no sign of anyone following her, but she wasn't taking chances. When she pulled up to the building, she parked a block away, just in case. Daniel's apartment had been abandoned since his death. The landlord had tried to rent it out, but rumors about what had happened there had scared off potential tenants. That worked in her favor. She knew the place was still empty. She walked around to the back, where the maintenance door was usually left unlocked. It was. Slipping inside, she kept her footsteps light, moving quickly up the stairs to Daniel's unit. The door had been padlocked, but she was prepared for that. Pulling a small crowbar from her bag, she wedged it between the door and the frame, wincing as the wood creaked loudly. After a few tense moments, the lock snapped, and the door swung open. The apartment smelled stale, like dust and forgotten memories. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the bare floor. The place had been cleared out, but Sarah wasn't looking for furniture. She was looking for something hidden. She started with the obvious places. Under the sink, inside the closets, behind the bathroom mirror. Nothing. Then she noticed something. The floorboard near the bedroom door was slightly raised. Kneeling, she pressed down on it. It wobbled. Her pulse quickened. Using her pocket knife, she pried the board up. Beneath it, in a small, hollowed-out space, was a bundle of cash wrapped in plastic. Bingo. She reached for it just as a sound behind her made her freeze. A footstep. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood in the doorway, his face obscured by the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. Sarah's fingers tightened around the bundle of cash. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man stepped forward, into the light. He was tall, muscular, with a scar running down the side of his face. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was tense. "Put the money down," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to get out of there. "Who are you working for?" The man took another step closer. "You ask too many questions. Just walk away, Dr. Whitman. This isn't your fight." Sarah's grip on the cash tightened. "It is now. Where is Mark?" The man's expression didn't change. "Mark? Mark Harris, my friend. He went missing last night, right after we got too close. And I'm guessing you had something to do with it." The man sighed. "You're persistent. I'll give you that. But you need to let this go." Sarah's jaw clenched. Not a chance. For a moment, they stood in silence, neither willing to back down. Then, without warning, the man lunged. Sarah barely had time to react. She threw herself backward, clutching the cash to her chest as she scrambled to her feet. The man grabbed for her, but she twisted away, knocking over a chair in the process. He cursed, reaching for something under his jacket. A gun. She didn't think. She ran. Bolting through the apartment door, she barreled down the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear his footsteps pounding behind her. He was fast, but she had the advantage of knowing where she was going. Bursting through the maintenance door, she sprinted toward her car. Her hands fumbled with the keys as she yanked the door open and threw herself inside. Just as she started the engine, the man emerged from the alleyway, his expression furious. She didn't wait. She slammed the gas pedal, tires screeching as she sped away. Her hands trembled on the wheel, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had the money. But now, more than ever, she knew she was in real danger, and Mark was still missing. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She hesitated before answering. "Dr. Whitman," a voice drawled. "You've been very busy. I hope you know what you're getting yourself into." Sarah's breath caught. "Who is this?" "Let's just say, you have something that belongs to me, and I want it back." The call ended. Sarah stared at her phone, realizing she had just become the center of something far bigger than she had ever anticipated. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Her breathing was uneven, her heart pounding against her ribs. The weight of the cash sitting in the passenger seat was nothing compared to the heavy realization settling in her gut. She was in deep, and the people she had crossed weren't going to let this go easily. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights closing in behind her. The roads were dark and empty, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Whoever had called her wasn't bluffing. She had something they wanted, and now she was a loose end. Her mind raced. Where could she go? She couldn't go home. Not when she had just been threatened. The clinic was out of the question, too. Mark's house? No, that wasn't safe either. She needed somewhere they wouldn't think to look, at least until she figured out her next move. Then it hit her. Lisa. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed Lisa's number. The call rang long enough to make her stomach tighten before the groggy voice finally answered. "Sarah?" Lisa sounded disoriented. "It's past midnight. What's going on?" "I need your help," Sarah said quickly. "I can't explain over the phone, but I need somewhere to lay low, just for a few hours." Lisa hesitated. "Are you in trouble?" Sarah exhaled sharply. "Yes." Lisa didn't ask any more questions. "Okay, come to my place. I'll leave the back door unlocked." Relief flooded through Sarah. "Thank you." She drove in silence, forcing herself to stay alert, her eyes scanning for any sign that she was being followed. It took her 15 minutes to reach Lisa's house, a small bungalow at the edge of town. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting eerie shadows across the lawns. Sarah parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, her pulse quickening with each step. She slipped through the backyard and found the door ajar, just as Lisa had promised. She stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. Lisa was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed, concern etched on her face. "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" Sarah set the bundle of cash on the table, then ran a hand through her hair. "I found this in Daniel's apartment." Lisa's eyes widened. "Is that?" Sarah nodded. "I think it's what got him killed. And now, they're after me." Lisa stared at the money, then back at Sarah. "Who's they?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know yet, but they took Mark." Lisa's breath hitched. "Mark's missing." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes, and I think it's because we were getting too close." Lisa ran a hand down her face. "Sarah, this is serious." "I know." Lisa sighed and pulled out a chair. "Okay. First, we need to figure out what to do with that money. Keeping it is dangerous." Sarah nodded. "I know. But I also think it's leverage." Lisa frowned. Leverage for what? For getting Mark back. Lisa looked at her, skepticism evident. Sarah, you don't negotiate with people like this. You don't even know who they are. Exactly, Sarah said, which is why I need to find out. Lisa chewed her lip. You have a plan? Sarah hesitated. Not yet, but I know someone who might. Lisa leaned forward. Who? Sarah took a deep breath. Daniel's old contact. If he had money hidden away, someone had to know about it. Someone on the inside. Lisa's face darkened. You think someone in his circle betrayed him? Sarah exhaled. I think that's exactly what happened. Lisa rubbed her temples. Okay, let's say you track this person down. Then what? Then, Sarah said, I find out where they're keeping Mark. Lisa hesitated before finally nodding. All right, but you're not doing this alone. Sarah looked at her. Lisa? No, Lisa interrupted. You're already in too deep. You're not getting yourself killed over this. Sarah knew arguing would be pointless. Lisa was right. She couldn't do this alone. And if Lisa was willing to help, she wasn't going to refuse. Okay, Sarah said. Then let's get started. Lisa grabbed her laptop. If we're looking for Daniel's contacts, we need to go through whatever records we can find. Did he ever leave behind any notes, emails, anything that might help? Sarah thought back to what little she had gathered. There were some old notebooks in his apartment, but I didn't have time to grab them. Lisa smirked. Then we go back. Sarah hesitated. It's too risky. That guy was there, and I doubt he left. Lisa tapped her fingers against the table. Then we need a distraction. Sarah frowned. Like what? Lisa glanced at the money. You said they want this back, right? What if we make them think they can get it? Sarah's stomach twisted. That's dangerous. Lisa nodded. Yes, but it might be the only way to flush them out. Sarah considered the idea. It was reckless, but they were running out of time. If Mark was still alive, they needed to move fast. Fine, she said. But we do it on my terms. Lisa grinned. That's the spirit. Let's bait the trap. Sarah rubbed her temples, exhaustion setting in, but she forced herself to stay focused. Lisa's plan was reckless, but it had merit. The only way to force the people after them to make a mistake was to lure them into the open. If they thought they could retrieve the money, they might just reveal where Mark was being held. Lisa sat across from her, typing rapidly on her laptop, her face illuminated by the dim glow of the screen. We need to be smart about this, she said, her voice steady but firm. We can't just put the money out there and hope for the best. We need a controlled environment, somewhere they'll think they're in control, but where we actually hold the upper hand. Sarah exhaled. What are you thinking? Lisa turned the laptop to show Sarah a location on the map, a remote warehouse on the outskirts of town. This place has been abandoned for years. If we make them think you're willing to negotiate, they'll have no choice but to show up. We'll control the environment and be ready for them. Sarah stared at the screen. And if they bring backup? Guns? We don't exactly have an army. Lisa hesitated before nodding. That's why we need to tip off the police. Anonymously. Just enough to have them on alert nearby. If things go south, we'll have a safety net. Sarah considered it. It was dangerous, but she was out of options. Mark didn't have time for them to play it safe. Fine, she said. Let's set it up. Lisa got to work crafting an anonymous message, detailing a potential illicit transaction happening at the warehouse. Meanwhile, Sarah sent a text to the unknown number that had contacted her earlier. I have what you're looking for. Meet me at the old warehouse on Briar Road. Midnight, alone. The response came within minutes. "No games. If this is a setup, you won't walk away." Sarah's pulse quickened. "No setup. I just want to talk. Bring Mark." Silence. Then finally, a reply. "We'll see." Lisa glanced at the screen and exhaled. "Looks like they're biting." Sarah clenched her fists. "Now we just have to hope we're ready for whatever comes next." The rest of the evening was spent preparing. Lisa made a call to an old friend who worked in law enforcement, dropping just enough hints to ensure that a patrol car would be stationed nearby. Sarah checked and rechecked the surroundings of the warehouse, making sure there were multiple exits and places to hide if things went south. As midnight approached, Sarah and Lisa parked a short distance away from the warehouse. The air was thick with tension. The lot was eerily empty, save for the occasional flickering streetlight. Sarah clutched the duffel bag containing the money and stepped out of the car, her heart pounding. "You ready?" Lisa asked, her voice tight. Sarah nodded. "Let's do this." She walked toward the entrance of the warehouse, every step deliberate. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but she forced herself to stay calm. As she reached the entrance, the heavy metal door creaked open. A shadowy figure stood inside. "You're braver than I thought," the man said. Sarah recognized him, the same man who had cornered her at Daniel's apartment. His scarred face was partially obscured by the dim lighting, but she could still see the smirk on his lips. "Where's Mark?" she asked, keeping her voice even. The man chuckled. "Let's see the money first." Sarah unzipped the bag, just enough to show the bundles of cash. "Now, Mark." The man motioned to the side, and a door in the back creaked open. Two more men appeared, dragging a battered but alive Mark forward. His face was bruised, his hands tied, but he was conscious. Sarah's chest tightened. "Let him go." The man tilted his head. "That's not how this works. We take the money, we leave. Mark stays with us." Lisa, hiding behind one of the crates in the shadows, pressed the silent alarm she had set up. The police would be here soon. Sarah swallowed hard. "That's not going to happen." The man took a step closer, his expression darkening. "Then I guess we have a problem." Before Sarah could react, a distant siren echoed through the night. Lisa whispered into the earpiece they were using. "That's our cue." The man's face twisted in anger. "You set us up!" Chaos erupted as the men scrambled, realizing they had been tricked. Mark took advantage of the momentary distraction, kicking one of them in the knee before stumbling toward Sarah. She caught him, supporting his weight as Lisa sprinted out of the shadows. The police cars came screeching into the lot just as the men tried to escape. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, forcing them to surrender. Sarah exhaled sharply, her grip tightening around Mark. He coughed, then managed a weak smile. "Took you long enough?" Sarah let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through her. "Next time, don't get kidnapped." Lisa smirked as the officers secured the criminals. "Well, that was fun. Let's not do it again." Sarah looked down at the money still clutched in her hand. It had nearly cost them everything, but at least now, the nightmare was over. Or so she hoped. Sarah knew better than to assume the danger was completely behind them. Even as she sat with Mark in the back of an ambulance, watching paramedics tend to his injuries, her mind raced with possibilities. The men who had come after them were now in custody, but she doubted the people who orchestrated the entire operation would go down so easily. "They'll talk," Lisa said quietly, appearing at Sarah's side. "The police will get something out of them." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't convinced. "If they know anything..." Lisa crossed her arms. "They have to know something. No one risks a job like that without knowing who they're working for." Mark coughed and gave Sarah a weary smile. "Thanks for not giving up on me." She squeezed his hand gently. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." The paramedics gave Mark a clean bill of health, minus some bruises and dehydration, and released him. The police wanted statements from all of them, but Lisa insisted they speak to her first. Sarah hung back, watching Lisa's confident demeanor as she talked to the officers. The way she kept control of the situation gave Sarah a small measure of comfort. At least someone knew how to handle things. When Lisa returned, her face was serious. "They're holding those guys at the station, but they haven't said much yet. Looks like their lawyer showed up quick." Sarah frowned. "Who sends lawyers to thugs that fast?" Lisa shrugged. "Someone with money and something to hide." Mark sighed, leaning heavily on Sarah's shoulder. "So, what now?" Sarah glanced at Lisa, then back at Mark. "We keep pushing. If the police can't get answers from them, we find someone who can." Mark looked doubtful. "Is that safe?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but sitting around doing nothing isn't an option." Lisa drove while Sarah sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. The city passed by in a blur, streetlights streaking through the glass, casting shifting patterns across her face. Mark was safe now, resting back at the clinic under the watchful eye of one of the officers. The immediate danger had passed, but the knot in Sarah's stomach hadn't loosened. There were still too many unanswered questions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. "What's our plan?" Lisa asked, her hand steady on the wheel. Sarah turned to her, the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. "We can't rely on the police. The men they arrested are just foot soldiers. They'll lawyer up, keep their mouths shut, and go right back to whoever's pulling the strings." Lisa frowned. "So we go around them?" Sarah nodded. "We find the person at the top. If we cut the head off the snake, the rest will fall apart." Lisa glanced at her. "That's ambitious. But how do we get to the top?" Sarah thought about Daniel Carter, about the money, about the men who had tried so hard to keep her from finding out the truth. "I don't know yet, but I have a feeling Daniel kept records. He was paranoid. He hid the money, which means he probably hid other things too. If we can find his notes, his files, anything, then we'll have leverage." Lisa nodded, her jaw tight. "All right. Where do we start looking?" "Daniel's old contacts," Sarah said. "We know he wasn't working alone. There's someone out there who knows the whole story." Lisa sighed. "So we're chasing ghosts." "Not ghosts," Sarah said. "Leads. We just have to find the right one." They drove in silence for a while, the car's tires humming against the asphalt. Sarah's mind churned, running through everything she knew. Daniel's family was a dead end. His old apartment had been searched. The money had been recovered. But there was still something missing. Something they had overlooked. And then it hit her. "His car," Sarah said suddenly. Lisa glanced at her. "What about it?" "When we found Rusty, I didn't think about it at the time, but Daniel's car wasn't anywhere near the alley. He must have left it somewhere else." Lisa frowned. "And you think there might be something in it?" "If Daniel was trying to disappear, he might have been living out of his car," Sarah said. "If it's still out there, it could hold the answers we need." Lisa nodded. "All right, let's find the car." They spent the next several hours digging through parking records, abandoned vehicle reports, anything that might lead them to Daniel's car. It was tedious, painstaking work, but eventually they found a lead. A sedan registered in Daniel's name. Impounded months earlier after being left in a no-parking zone on the outskirts of the city. By the time they reached the impound lot, the sun was rising. The lot attendant gave them a skeptical look as they explained what they were looking for. But after some convincing, and a hefty fee, he led them to a dusty, beat-up sedan tucked in the back row. Sarah's pulse quickened as she approached the car. The windows were dirty, the paint faded, but the doors were locked tight. Lisa handed her a set of tools, and after a few minutes of delicate work, the lock clicked open. The inside of the car was cluttered but intact. The back seat was piled with clothes, fast food wrappers, and a few empty water bottles. The trunk yielded more of the same: old newspapers, a spare tire, a broken flashlight. "This doesn't look promising," Lisa said, rummaging through the glove compartment. Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She felt along the sides of the seats, checking for hidden compartments. Her fingers brushed against something hard, wedged under the driver's seat. She pulled it out, her heart racing. It was a small black notebook. She flipped it open, scanning the pages. They were filled with cramped handwriting, notes and numbers that made little sense at first glance. But as she read further, patterns began to emerge. Names, addresses, dates. Some crossed out, some circled. Sketches of what looked like storage units, notes about meetings, and cryptic references to the boss. "This is it," Sarah said, holding up the notebook. Lisa leaned over, peering at the pages. "You think this will lead us to who's behind it all?" Sarah nodded. If Daniel was keeping track of everything, this notebook might hold the key. Lisa took a deep breath. "All right, let's see where it leads." They left the impound lot and found a quiet diner where they could spread out the notebook and examine it more closely. Over cups of bad coffee, they pieced together the fragments of Daniel's notes. One address kept coming up, a warehouse near the docks. It was circled several times, with a date next to it that matched the day Daniel disappeared. "That's our next stop," Sarah said. Lisa hesitated. "It could be a trap." "It probably is," Sarah said. "But it's the only lead we have." Lisa nodded. "Then we'll go prepared." They spent the next few hours gathering supplies: flashlights, extra cell phone batteries, a first aid kit. Lisa even managed to borrow a small stun gun from a friend. When they were ready, they set out for the docks, the tension between them thick as they approached the address from the notebook. The warehouse loomed large in the early morning light, its windows dark, its metal siding streaked with rust. Sarah parked the car a block away, and they approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. "If something goes wrong, we get out immediately," Lisa whispered. Sarah nodded. "Agreed." They slipped through a side entrance, the door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through the cavernous space. Rows of crates and pallets filled the warehouse floor, creating a maze of narrow aisles. Sarah held up the notebook, checking the sketch of the layout Daniel had drawn. "The office should be that way," she whispered, pointing to the far corner of the building. They moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by the dusty concrete. As they approached the office, Sarah's pulse quickened. The door was slightly open, and a faint light glowed inside. Lisa raised the stun gun, nodding for Sarah to lead the way. Sarah pushed the door open slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The office was cluttered with papers and old equipment. A computer sat on a desk, its monitor casting a faint blue glow. Sarah approached cautiously, scanning the room for any sign of movement. "Looks clear," she whispered. Lisa stepped inside, keeping her eyes on the doorway. Sarah sat down at the desk and began rifling through the papers. Many were invoices and shipping records, but some were handwritten notes in the same style as the notebook. More names, more dates, and one word that stood out: shipment. "What is it?" Lisa asked, peering over her shoulder. "Daniel must have been keeping track of something big," Sarah said. "A shipment he was supposed to move. But something went wrong." Lisa frowned. "You think that's what got him killed?" Sarah nodded. "It's possible. If this shipment was valuable enough, whoever was behind it wouldn't hesitate to get rid of anyone who threatened it." Lisa glanced at the monitor. "Can you get into the computer?" Sarah tapped a few keys. The desktop was unprotected, and a folder labeled Projects caught her eye. She opened it, revealing dozens of files with cryptic names. One file stood out: Contact List X. She opened it and scanned the contents. It was a list of names, phone numbers, and notes. Some names had stars next to them, others were crossed out. Near the bottom, she found a name she recognized: the man who had confronted her at the apartment. "This is it," Sarah said. "A list of everyone Daniel was working with. If we follow these leads, we'll find out who's behind everything." Lisa leaned in, her eyes scanning the screen. "This is big. If we hand this over to the police..." Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We need to verify it first." Lisa hesitated. "Sarah, if we hold on to this too long, we're putting ourselves at risk." Sarah nodded. "I know, but if we can confirm who's at the top, we'll have the leverage we need." They copied the files onto a flash drive and carefully erased their tracks. As they slipped out of the warehouse and back into the fading morning light, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. They were finally closing in on the truth. But she also knew that the closer they got, the more dangerous it would become. Sarah, Lisa, and Mark sat in the small diner, the remnants of a long and grueling night weighing heavily on them. The notebook lay on the table, along with the flash drive, its contents finally giving them a clear picture of who had been pulling the strings. Every name, every transaction, every shadowy meeting point. Daniel had recorded it all. The more they pieced it together, the more it became apparent that this wasn't just about money. It was about power, influence, and secrets too dangerous to let loose. Mark leaned forward, his voice still raspy from his ordeal. This is what they killed Daniel over. This shipment, this list of contacts. He was trying to get out, trying to do the right thing, and they took him out for it. Lisa nodded grimly. "And they were ready to do the same to you, Sarah. To both of you." Sarah stared down at the notebook, her mind racing. "We have what we need to bring them down. This contact list, the shipment details, it's enough to build a case against them." Mark shook his head. "If we go to the police now, they'll bury it. These people have connections everywhere. We need someone who can actually do something with this." Lisa crossed her arms. "And who's that? Some kind of whistleblower hotline? We don't exactly have a network of allies waiting to take these guys down." Sarah looked up, her gaze steady. "We go public." Mark and Lisa both stared at her in stunned silence. Lisa recovered first. "You mean, like the news? Expose them?" "Yes," Sarah said. "If we make all of this public, if we give it to a journalist, someone who can get the story out there, they won't be able to hide anymore. Once the public knows what they've done, they'll be forced to face justice." Mark frowned. "And what happens to us? They'll know it came from us. They'll come after us again." "They'll already know," Sarah said. "But if we do nothing, they'll keep hurting people. They'll keep doing whatever it takes to keep their secrets. Daniel tried to run and it got him killed. The only way to stop them is to drag everything into the light. Lisa tapped her fingers on the table, her expression conflicted. You really think going public will make a difference? What if no one believes us? We have evidence, Sarah said, holding up the notebook. Names, dates, financial records. This isn't just hearsay. It's a paper trail that points right to them. Mark sighed heavily. It's risky, but if we don't do it, we're just waiting for them to make their next move. Sarah nodded. Exactly. We need to take control of the narrative. If we wait too long, they'll find us again. They'll shut us down. Lisa rubbed her temples. All right, let's say we go public. Who do we trust to run this story? Sarah thought for a moment, then said, I know someone. A journalist who's not afraid to take on powerful people. If we can get this to her, she'll make sure it gets out. Lisa still looked hesitant, but finally she nodded. Okay, let's do it. But we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more danger we're in. Mark glanced around the diner. What about Rusty? If they find out we still have him, we'll make sure he's safe, Sarah said quickly. We can't let him become a target again. But right now, we have to focus on exposing the truth. With a plan in place, they gathered their evidence and left the diner. Sarah contacted the journalist, explaining just enough to convince her to meet. That evening, they handed over everything. Files, notebooks, even the audio recordings from the warehouse. The journalist was stunned by the depth of the conspiracy and promised to start digging immediately. Days passed, each one feeling like a year. Sarah and Lisa stayed on high alert, moving from place to place, never staying in one spot too long. Mark recovered slowly, his wounds healing, but his trust in the world deeply shaken. Rusty remained by his side, his presence a constant reminder of why they were fighting. Then, one morning, the story broke. Headlines splashed across major news outlets, detailing the intricate web of corruption, the mysterious shipments, and the names behind the operation. The journalist had done her job, connecting the dots and delivering a piece so damning it couldn't be ignored. Public outrage was immediate. Law enforcement agencies were forced to launch investigations. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from anyone named in the reports. The people at the top, the ones who had seemed untouchable, were now under scrutiny. Subpoenas were issued. Arrests were made. Sarah watched it all unfold from a safe house, her heart heavy but relieved. The truth was finally out there. The danger wasn't completely gone. There were still those who would hold a grudge. But the grip these people had on everyone's lives was loosening. Mark sat next to her, Rusty at his feet. You did it, Sarah, he said quietly. You made sure Daniel's death wasn't in vain. Sarah shook her head. We did it. All of us. Lisa smiled faintly. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad it's over. But if I never have to deal with something like this again, it'll be too soon. Sarah managed a small laugh. Same here. Let's stick to more peaceful cases from now on. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything they'd been through slowly lifting. The world hadn't changed overnight, but they had made a difference. They had stood up to something larger than themselves and brought the truth into the light. And for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She reached down, scratching behind Rusty's ears. Good boy, she whispered. Rusty wagged his tail softly, and Sarah smiled. The road ahead might still have its challenges, but they had faced the worst and come out stronger. Together.